Very good evening and welcome to Iron Issues. Today our focus is on a trend that stands on a tripod. First, you're looking at the issue of orphanages and its operations in Nigeria. You're also looking at the crime of human trafficking and illegal baby cells. Of course, if you had joined the conversation last week, you would have known that we talked about mainstream media, media practitioners, and of course the abuses that journalists feel go through in the line of duty. All of these issues will form part of a discuss this evening on Eyes on Issues, and I'm glad to welcome you. Just in case you did miss out last week on, of course, the conversation surrounding media practitioners and the mugging or attempt to gag the press in Nigeria through agents of government, where we've seen different attacks on either the journalists themselves or the media houses and organizations these journalists work for. Now, of course, all of these issues are issues of great concern, particularly looking at the fact that Nigeria's poverty index is consistently on the increase. My name is Francis Oyimaidet, and I'm delighted to be your host this evening. And of course, just taking a mind back as a background information. Now, we know that there are several reports on a daily basis, but let's look at the Delta State Police Command report on the arrest of 2 male suspects and, of course, the rescuing of 3 pregnant women from a baby factory in the latest of what has become a scandalous business in human trafficking and associated crimes in Nigeria. Now, in several locations across the country today, mostly in the south, impregnated girls are held captive until they give birth, and of course upon giving birth they are being compelled to give up their babies for varying sums of money per head depending on the sex of the child. Unfortunately, this illicit trade is part of an international ring in human slavery and organ trafficking, for which of course Nigeria is becoming increasingly notorious. Unfortunately, the crime seems to be thriving among some desperate individuals who have come to regard it as a business. These persons, syndicates, move around the streets of Nigeria scouting for young and impoverished females with unwanted pregnancies to lure them to many of the so-called homes and orphanages where they are kept until they are delivered of their babies, which they then buy. Now, information at our disposal shows that also young men are brought in across the country into these homes to impregnate the girls that are not already pregnant. And of course, these girls are being subjected to different inhuman treatment. They're repeatedly assaulted, repeatedly raped, and of course, regardless of the level or the month of pregnancy, they're still being inhumanly treated across these different homes. Now we see that the Nigerian security forces over the years have, conducted a couple of raids. Of course, we've also seen arrests being made, and we know that the fight against human trafficking in persons, as Nigerians would ask, and the average, person would ask, why do we have human trafficking in persons on the increase in Nigeria? Why do we have baby factories, particularly in the East, thriving? And of course, we're also talking about the adoption of children, or the illegal adoption of children by couples who do not have children or possibly cannot conceive of their own. We'll look into all of these issues and see how we can, proffer solutions to. We'll look at the challenges. We'll look at why young women who are pregnant would even consider the option of selling their children or selling their child or giving their child up for adoption, or some who are forced to do so. We'll look at the trauma and, of course, the scenario that they have had to go through. My guest this evening, of course, remains Lady Ejiro Omokoro, an investigative journalist, publisher, and executive director of Light Ray Media. She's going to be joining us virtually to discuss these issues today. We'll just take a short pause, and when we come back, we will be opening the conversation up with Lady Ejiro. Stay with us.
Business exists only to meet the needs of the people. But there's an extra advantage if your product and services are pitched on a platform that gives you the added advantage over your competitors. For your desired return on investment and so much more, advertise on Spectrum Television, on StarTime's DTH Channel 421 and on free-to-air with a frequency of 12733. Spectrum Television, broadening your horizon.
Glad to welcome you back. This is Iron Issues coming to you live on Spectrum Television. Of course, I encourage you to follow us on our socials at Spectrum TV.ng to be part of our conversation this evening. My guest is Lady Ejiro Mukoro. She is an investigative journalist and, of course, a very strong advocate in the issue, one of the issues or both issues that we are focusing today. She's also the publisher and executive director, Light Ray Media. Good evening, Lady Ejiro. Welcome to Iron Issues. Good evening. Okay, let's hope Lady Ejiro can hear me. Good evening, Lady Ejiro. Can you hear me? Okay, seems the network is at it again, but the issue that we're focusing on today, human trafficking, baby cells, baby factories, criminal activities ongoing in orphanages and orphanage homes across Nigeria has been a focus. Of course, the United Nations has ranked Nigeria as one of the countries, or the third most common country where you have the crime being committed. You're talking about child trafficking as the third most common crime in Nigeria after financial fraud and drug trafficking. Now, report has it that at least 10 babies are sold each day in Nigeria. According to the UN, that has put the worth of the global child trafficking business at US dollars of in the range of 33 billion rather annually. Now, Association of Orphanages and Home Operators in Nigeria, ASHOHON, once made a commitment to help in combating the growing menace of illegal orphanages and homes in Nigeria. The goal was to chart a course for the industry and brainstorm on actionable solutions to problems confronting the association and Nigerian orphans. Of course, they had hoped that orphanages across the country will come together to network and exchange information and ideas that will provide a way forward to the many challenges that abound in the orphanage business. But unfortunately, just like many lofty ideas and move and advocacies, we're yet to see these coming to fruition. Unfortunately, also illegal baby factories in Nigeria are still operating. In fact, they are one of the most lucrative business currently on the rise. Now, oftentimes, small businesses disguised as private medical clinics, orphanages, or even social welfare homes. These factories are part of the wider human trafficking industry. And of course, you're also talking about child harvesting, the systemic sale of human children, of course, which has also risen as a lucrative trade in the country's black market. Although described as the third most common crime in the country after drug trafficking and financial fraud by 2006 UNESCO's report and subsequent reports up until 2021, efforts to stop its operations have found little success. Of course, the big question is, why do these baby factories exist in the first place? And what are the factors contributing to the existence of baby factories in Nigeria? We'll also be looking at the place of stigmatization when it concerns the teenage girls who get pregnant when they're yet to be legally married, and sometimes as a result of that, these young women who found themselves in family way earlier than anticipated or in a way that is not acceptable to the society get stigmatized, and as a result of that, most of these teenage girls run away and get into the hands of these human traffickers. Now, as it stands, the country leads to a high demand for babies by infertile couples who are unwilling to associate publicly with adoption or surrogacy due to additional stigma attached to it. My guest this evening, as I earlier introduced, is Lady Ejiro Mukoro, who is joining us all the way from Lagos. Of course, she's a journalist, an author, and a member of the media organization, also talking about the executive director, Light Ray Media. Welcome to Iron Issues. Sorry the network is at it again today, but I do hope it will be better than last time.
I hope so too. And is the connection a lot better now?
Yes, it's a lot better now. Welcome. So let's quickly wrap up on our conversation. The last time we were here, We're talking about media practitioners and the abuse in the line of duty. And of course, we had extensively dealt on it, but we couldn't, wrap up because of the network challenges. So the last few questions I have for you: in Nigeria, as we progress into the years to come, particularly with this new administration, what are the possible ways and engagement that we as broadcasters, as journalists, as media practitioners need to have to ensure that, as you had highlighted, we have a policy direction, we have legislations outside what has already been in existence that will ensure that, the armed forces and people understand the role of the media, and also stricter punitive measures, are put in place within the confines of the constitutions to protect our rights while we go about doing our duties of serving Nigerians?
It's a very simple one. Everybody just needs to understand that the media is an important facet of any democracy, not to mention any form of governance. Without dissemination of information, without giving people up-to-date news items, stories, and important data required to do business, required to live, even, for example, conversations about the nature of regular power electricity supply, the issue of employment, when you talk about healthcare system, road networks, businesses, the ability to thrive. At the bottom of it all is information. So whatever information people have is how powerful it can get. It's when the data and the source are very authentic, can be trusted, and can be used to address problems and proffer solutions to them. And that's why the media is the fourth estate. The same way we give credence, veneration to the executive and the legislator and the judiciary, that is how citizens should also treat the fourth estate, the media, especially the professional practicing media, not bloggers, not everyday writers who just claim titles here and there. The social media propagandists or social media content creators who just want to create content. Their job is to create content. They are not to provide journalism. There's a difference between journalism, journalistic work, compared to any other form of information dissemination. People do research, the academia do research, but the nature of the academia is that it has to be in a very condensed form sometimes, or as huge as it can be, depending on the nature of the research work being done. And what the journalists do is to get this data and break it down, both for the media consumption, but most importantly, for the citizens who need the right information to make informed choices and decisions that can influence their lives. So the conversation really is that we must begin to respect and give dignity and honor to the media, specifically those in broadcast journalism, who also do the legacy work required in that space on the social and digital media as well. Collaboration is key. Partnership of many forms are important, and there are many ways to do this. When we understand that, for example, a president or a governor or a House of Rep member, a senator, you represent your constituency. The media is a channel through which you actually communicate with them about the things you do. Sometimes you can use the TV, you can use radio, you can use print, you can use the social media, but you need professionals to do the job effectively. And they're supposed to hold you to account, because Section 21 of the Nigerian Constitution makes it clear that it is the job of the media to hold governors, judiciary, legislator, and every other person to account, including themselves. So as media organization, we also have our role with regards to how we treat our internal policies, our editorial, what is the internal politics we also play, where there's a situation where we constantly have conflict of interest. That's when media is not effective. But when there's clarity about what the policy drive is for the organization, and it's clear about the journalistic work, as well as for the public, and indeed for accountability purposes and the dissemination of truth, not false stories, often they do excel. It's a lot of work, but it is doable.
Okay, of course, that is exhaustive enough for us to allow that matter to slide. But let's talk about your publication, Distortion, which is one of the reasons why we're having this conversation. We know that, orphanages and their operations in Nigeria are becoming a serious case for concern and a serious menace threatening the lives of our young men and women. Particularly this evening, I read a story of, young women within the ages of 15 and 17 who were, taken away from IDPs in the north, brought down to the west and transformed into, sex slaves and, of course, different abuses, eventually made to carry pregnancies and their children sold away. But this is not a practice that is new to the Nigerian system, but a practice that has been there for a long time. Let's talk about your book, Distortion. What informed you, carrying a research about these particular trends in Nigeria?
It came about during the lockdown at the height of the gender-based violence and sexual gender-based violence, including inter-partner violence that we saw that was so common, not to mention the fact that there was a lot of child abuse. During lockdown, many persons, because of the nature of how the lockdown shuts down socialization, businesses, engagements that are external, and the fact that all our processes of the way we normally work became abnormally curtailed to such a degree that it began to stress people psychologically, physiologically, mentally, emotionally, and in many ways, even stomach infrastructure-wise, people were badly affected. Often, we knew that there were data that there was a high increase rate of persons who were being abused in homes sexually. At the height of the COVID-19, it became a pandemic inside a pandemic, which was why the Political Center USA, when they saw some of the investigative work I did regarding broken girls and broken boys, as well as the gender-based violence, the outbreak of it that became a crisis in Nigeria. And then we saw the unfortunate incidences of incest becoming on the rise, where fathers in particular in eastern part of Nigeria were really, really the #1 perpetrators and culprits of sexually abusing their children, where in some instances, these children become pregnant and they got abortion. But that was not enough. We even saw instances where children who were being abused needed help, and we wanted to provide them with shelters, and we could not provide them with shelters because nobody was willing to take them into the shelters because of fear of the outbreak of COVID, should in case they were hidden carriers of the virus itself. Now, some of these children had to go back to their molesters, and their molesters continued to molest them. And in many cases, we saw instances where these children got pregnant. Aside that, we also saw a pattern. The pattern we noticed was one where during this period, a lot of people wanted to also get pregnant. They couldn't get pregnant. And then we live in a society where it is so commonplace to insult people's fertility status as a definition of their identity. So if you're not pregnant, or you can't have a child, or you don't have children, you're wrongly labeled with pejorative by the society. So the society makes it an offense, a criminal offense for that matter, that you don't have a child is wrong. And that is where the foundation of this faulty premise is leading us to where we are today. There were so many instances where I discovered that some persons who were running what you called chemist shop, and that was what led to distortion, were actually a place where children were being impregnated without them realizing. It was a case of a man, in this instance, who was injecting very powerful drugs into this girl's drink and then lure them to sleep. They lose their senses. He takes them on. Some of them got pregnant. And when he was caught, he now wanted to escape. And the only way to escape was to be involved in more nefarious activity. And then he was engaged by a very important woman in the society that was called Mama G in the book Distortion. And what she did was that she turned this chemist into an inseminator. He became the man who inseminated children that were taken from the road runaways, and like you rightly mentioned, children who were from IDP camps, whose identity were not even know where they were from. Some of them were impregnated. Some of them were children who were indentured. In other words, they were brought from other parts of the world. Sometimes they were saying, oh, this is my cousin or that, and they leave as house, in quotes, you know that word housemaid or house girl for anybody in Nigeria. It's against the law. But they turn them into that. And then in the process, they send them out to carry out child extreme labor, selling under the street and all of that. And before you knew what was happening, you saw that these children who are now more vulnerable were easy targets by this chemist man as well as this woman who happened to be a pastor, for that matter, in a church. And all of this became a facade. So the church became the facade as if they were carrying out religious activity, whereas behind it was a child baby factory where they were selling children and using these babies for ritual and political advancement. This was what inspired the book, and I felt that it was important that we take it mainstream because it became so prevalent. We saw situations where adoption letters or documents are prepared in a fake manner. So these are things that, for example, the Lagos State, Delta State government, the Ministry of Women Affairs, right? This is a department that should be handled by the government, where people properly actually come to register and say, I want an adoption process to have an adopted child. But this has been frustrated on so many levels.
Okay,
to some extent, I will say that in Delta State, it seems to work.
Okay, now all of these issues, all of these issues that you've raised are things that Nigerians are aware of. But unfortunately, it seems that regardless of the different, raids that the Nigerian, main of the Nigerian police force have carried out, particularly within the East, now who seems to be very notorious with its practices, it seems the government's attention is not as big as it should be. So I'd like to ask, do you think the government of Nigeria and the respective state, particularly within the East, are doing enough in terms of their supervisory role in the operations of orphanages and other related homes, hospitality centers in their respective region?
I would say no, they are not. For example, the National Agency Against the Trafficking of Persons has about 33 shelters or so. Or I'm not even sure it's up to that, but their shelters are so few, 10 at least. They have 10 shelters in the whole of Nigeria. Now, that 10 shelters are supposed to protect people who are being trafficked, but there are not enough homes for them. Then another thing we realized in my investigation was that even some government officials are involved in the process of this illegality in child adoption, where proper documentations are not done, proper processes are not followed, there are no policies that are clearly outlined wherein they say they should do this specifically, and this is the process from table 1 to table 2 to table 3. Now, it's not as if it is not doable. There have been instances where these are doable, but the truth of the matter is, on ground, people just bastardize the system. They want to make money off the system because ordinarily the nature of adoption is that you're not supposed to pay a dime. You are not. You are supposed to prove that you have the capacity to be able to have a child, raise that child, fend for that child. But what has happened is people just feel that should not be enough. It should be a money-making process. And that's because there's no proper accountability, no monitoring, no proper consequences for those who engage in the act. And it has become an enabling business in society, like you rightly noted. Imagine 10 babies a day sold in Nigeria, and the monies are not little. You see instances, as a matter of fact, where even fathers who have children are now beginning to sell their children. So what has come to happen is, and it's very sad because humans have become commodities for sale to who can afford or is willing to sell. And the psyche that we have and we're enabling in Nigeria is a big problem, a huge problem where it's clear we don't value a human life. We don't respect the Child Rights Act, which clearly makes it clear that the child is an important entity, is an individual that should be respected and has its own human rights. Our African culture, to some extent, I'm not saying all, tends to make it look like children are supposed to be silent, unheard of, and not important. They do not have a say at the table, which is wrong. And that's why you see the proliferation of so-called houseboys and housegirls, little children brought from villages and elsewhere to stay with certain people, either posing as relative or simply just doing what they are supposed to be there for, slaves. So in Lagos, for example, there are proper offices for this. In Delta State also, there are proper offices and departments meant to carry out this process of adoption. But the reality on ground is that they don't do it. There is no enforcement. There is no proper monitoring. There are no consequences on this criminal behavior. So and this is at the heart of the problem.
Now, does this mean, therefore, that the Nigerian constitutions and, of course, the laws of the land is not strong enough to protect the rights of these categories of people, particularly the children? Now we know that domestication about the child right law has been also an issue. We're talking about issues surrounding child marriage in the north and other